The night the jungle refused to sleep, a damp silence hung over the ridge like a wet shroud. The men of 2nd Platoon, Fox Company, 165th Infantry, were scattered across a thin, twisting line of mud-filled foxholes that clung to a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. They were only 12, exhausted, hungry, and worn down by weeks of relentless marching, but tonight they stood between a battalion-sized Japanese force and the American artillery positions miles behind them. If the Japanese broke through this ridge, the guns would fall, and the entire American line on the northern flank would collapse by morning. Sergeant Daniel Mack McAllister crouched in his slit trench, his damp hands wrapped around an M1 rifle he had cleaned 3 times that evening, not because it was dirty but because the act kept his mind steady. The air smelled of wet leaves, cordite, and the sour rot of the jungle. A drizzle tapped against the palm fronds overhead. For hours, scouts had heard movement, shuffling feet, clipped whispers, the telltale rustle of bamboo stalks being parted. A large Japanese force was assembling at the base of the ridge. Mack knew that with only 12 men, including 2 who could barely stand from dysentery, they had no chance of holding off a frontal assault. Not conventionally, not by the book, but Mack did not intend to fight by the book. He had survived Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and a dozen small skirmishes where the rulebook was nothing but dead weight in a rucksack. And he had learned one thing. What high command deemed forbidden, or improper, often meant too creative for the brass to understand. Tonight, that creativity would be their only chance. The ridge was narrow, barely 20 feet across in its widest stretch, which made it perfect for the trick he had discovered on Guadalcanal 2 years prior. It involved reworking a standard trench defense into a layered, deceptive kill zone. It wasn't in any manual. In fact, Division had officially banned similar trench alterations because they violated standard engineering protocols and encouraged unpredictable fighting behavior. The brass hated unpredictability. Mack loved it. The drizzle turned into a steady patter. Raindrops glistened on the leaves as if the jungle had sprouted 1,000 watchful eyes. The men watched him. They were scared, but they trusted him. "Sergeant," Private Collins whispered from a nearby foxhole, "you think they'll try tonight?" Mack gave a low, steady reply. "They're down there now. They'll come when they think we're sleeping. Stay low, conserve ammo, keep your heads clear. Won't be much good with 12 against that many," Collins muttered. Mack looked down the line. 12 men. A ridge that snaked like a dying python. Mud, rain, darkness, and one forbidden trick. "That's why," Mack whispered, "they're not going to be fighting all 12. He left it at that. The less they knew, the calmer they stayed. He had spent 2 hours earlier that afternoon modifying the trench layout, using a small shovel and his bare hands. The trick relied on a simple truth. Soldiers fired where they heard fire. If he could make the Japanese hear fire where no one actually was, he could control their movement like cattle down a chute. And if, at the same time, they couldn't see the real shooters, 12 men could feel like 100. It all depended on timing. And on the rain. The ridge sloped sharply downward into the jungle valley, where the Japanese were massing. Thin trails wound toward the ridge like black veins. Bamboo clusters blocked visibility. The terrain was steep enough that sound bounced unpredictably in the rain. Perfect. Mack took a deep breath and sank deeper into his trench. The trick was ready. The men were ready. Now they simply had to survive the night. The first indication came not through sound but vibration, just a faint tremble in the mud wall of Mack's trench. Boots. Hundreds of them. A faint whistle sounded from the valley. A bird call. 2 short, 1 long. Japanese signal. "All right, boys," Mack whispered, "this is it. On my mark." The jungle held its breath. The darkness thickened. Then the attack began. A shrill cry, "Banzai," rose like a blade from the jungle floor. Hundreds of voices answered. The valley exploded with noise. The Japanese surged uphill, rifles slung, bayonets pointed forward, expecting to overrun a weakened line quickly. This was their standard tactic: to shock, to overwhelm, to break morale in the first 30 seconds. But instead of hearing steady rifle fire in response, they heard something else entirely. Silence. Mack's men obeyed orders perfectly. They held fire. The Japanese charge faltered slightly. They were used to defenders panicking early, firing too soon, giving away their positions. Here, The defenders waited. Mack gripped the whistle between his teeth. 3 seconds more. The Japanese crested the halfway point of the slope. Now, he blew one short blast, barely audible beneath the rain. The first part of the trick activated. On both ends of the ridge, far from the men, Mack had placed 2 sound pits. Small pockets dug into the ridge wall, covered by palm leaves, each holding a single Browning automatic rifle pointed away from the enemy. When fired, the shots would echo forward from the ridge as if from multiple positions. They were manned not by soldiers, but by the 2 weakest members of the platoon, Privates Jimenez and Hall, who could barely walk but could still pull a trigger while lying flat in a pit. On the whistle, they opened up. The 2 bars roared into the jungle night. Echoes bounced wildly off the valley walls. To an approaching enemy it sounded like machine guns firing from dozens of positions. The Japanese charge wavered. Then came the second part. Mack's real riflemen, hidden deeper and lower in modified trenches that dipped beneath the jungle route line, opened fire from angles impossible to spot. The trenches were staggered, each pair firing from slits that aimed downward into the jungle but were invisible from the front. No muzzle flash, no silhouettes, no movement. The Japanese saw nothing, but they heard everything. The slope became a killing field. Rounds tore through the advancing wave. Soldiers dropped in the mud, tumbling into their comrades. Confusion swallowed the charge. Officers shouted commands, but the rain and echoes distorted their orders. Normally, under such chaos, Japanese soldiers would attempt to flank. But the sound pits created the illusion that large American squads were stationed at both ends of the ridge. They had nowhere to go but forward. And forward led straight into Mack's invisible kill zone. "Keep it tight," Mack yelled to his men. Short bursts. Aim low. Let 'em bunch up. They did. Collins fired until his rifle steamed in the rain. Chen swapped magazines with shaking hands but a sharp, focused expression. Morgan, normally a quiet farmer from Iowa, kept muttering prayers each time he pulled the trigger. Then, the Japanese did something Mack had expected. They dropped into the mud. And vanished. Mack grinned. He whispered, "Stage 3. The Japanese were known for disappearing into darkness and rushing the last few yards in sudden sprints. Mack had prepared for this too. Because his trenches dipped downward instead of upward, his men could fire into the mud line, a deadly angle that caught soldiers trying to crawl unseen. Again, not by the book. Again, incredibly effective. Mack fired 3 rounds into a shadow creeping along the left flank and saw the shadow stiffen, then roll backward. Another group charged in a crouched sprint. "Left, left," Mack called. His 2 leftmost riflemen pivoted and unleashed overlapping fire, mowing down the charging group before they reached the first set of rocks. Still, the Japanese kept coming. A full battalion. 500 men. 12 men on a ridge firing from invisible trenches. They could hold, but not forever. The first sign of trouble came from the right, where a grenade exploded closer than it should have. Collins screamed, "They're up the slope. They're pushing right side." Mack lunged across his trench, slipping in mud, and peered right. Shadows moved among the trees. 30, maybe 40 soldiers, attempting to climb the ridge wall instead of rushing the front. They had found the one angle he couldn't cover with trench fire. But he had planned for this as well. "Signal 2, Mack barked. Private Harrow, who had been clutching a small satchel at his feet, nodded and ran. Yes, ran, along the back of the ridge line to a point Mack had marked hours earlier. It was a spur, a natural stone shelf overlooking the rear right slope. The forbidden trick had one more piece, the false withdrawal. Mack had cleared the area behind the spur so it looked like a retreat path, footprints, scuffed mud, discarded ration tins. Then he had placed 2 riflemen there with orders to remain silent until needed. As Harrow arrived, he let out the prearranged shout, "They're falling back." The Japanese assault group heard it. Their discipline cracked at once. Falling back. The Americans were retreating. The ridge was theirs. The entire group charged up the side path toward the spur, eager to overrun the retreating defenders. They never saw the 2 American riflemen behind the rock shelf. 10 yards from the crest, Mack's trap sprung. A hail of point-blank rifle fire tore down the slope. The Japanese attack group disintegrated, tumbling backward into the mud. The right flank was saved. But now the real danger arrived. Artillery. A Japanese light mortar team had set up in the valley and began launching 50mm shells at the ridge. The first blew apart a rotting tree stump. The second landed near Collins' trench, showering him with dirt. The third landed only 10 feet from Mack. He was thrown sideways, ears ringing. Mud filled his mouth. He wiped it away, dizzy but alive. "Sergeant," Collins shouted, "they're bringing up the heavies." "We can't." "We can," Mack barked. "We hold." But his stomach twisted. Mortars would rip apart his modified trenches. The trick had worked brilliantly against infantry, but mortars didn't care about illusions. He squinted into the jungle. The light mortar flashes were faint but visible. Then Mack did something even his men didn't expect. He climbed out of his trench. "Sergeant," someone hissed. "Get down." Mack ignored them. He scanned the slope. His mind raced. He needed to silence that mortar team, but he couldn't send a squad. They would die in seconds. He had one option. He sprinted to Hall's sound pit. The right one, slid into the mud beside the exhausted private, and grabbed the bar from his trembling hands. "Sir," Hall whispered weakly. "You rest," Mack said. "I'll take it from here." He adjusted the bar forward, bracing it on the pit's edge. The angle was terrible. The weapon wasn't meant to fire downward from that position, but Mack wasn't aiming at soldiers. He fired at the muzzle flashes. 3 bursts, 2 misses. The third burst struck the mortar team. 3 figures fell. 1 rolled down the slope. The mortar fire stopped. Mack exhaled hard. His shoulder throbbed from the bar recoil. But now the Japanese realized one of the sound pits had real shooters. A half platoon peeled away and began rushing the right flank again. Mack crawled out of the pit, grabbed Hall by the collar, and dragged him to a safer trench. Bullets snapped overhead. "Boys," Mack shouted, "shift fire. Right flank." The line erupted. Every man who could still shoot swiveled to cover the new threat. Rifle cracks, bar bursts, and grenades thundered across the ridge. Still the Japanese came. 10 yards, 6 yards, 3 yards. One soldier leapt onto the ridge edge, swinging a bayonet straight toward Collins' face. But Morgan shot him mid-air, the body collapsing inches from Collins' trench. Then the final wave approached. It was not a charge. It was a slow, coordinated, disciplined advance, veteran troops moving in tight formation, stepping over fallen comrades, firing short controlled bursts. These were elite Japanese infantry, the kind who had fought the British, the Chinese, the Australians. They were used to taking heavy losses and still pressing forward. Mack knew his trick had run its course. The illusion was cracking. The enemy was adapting. "Tighten up," he yelled. "Every shot counts." Rounds flew both ways. A bullet grazed Chen's arm. Another hit Morgan's helmet, denting it. Collins' rifle jammed. He cursed, cleared it, and resumed firing. The rain increased, turning the ridge into a slick, muddy slide. Then one of the elite Japanese soldiers lobbed a grenade directly into Mack's trench. Mack saw it too late. It landed beside his knee. He had a second, maybe less. He kicked it. It bounced out of the trench, tumbled down the slope, and exploded mid-roll. Shrapnel hit his leg. A burning pain tore through his calf. He fell backward. He heard shouts. Rifle fire. The thunder of incoming boots. The Japanese were only yards away now. He forced himself upright. Blood poured from his leg. He crawled to the trench edge and looked down. 500 had come. Maybe 200 remained. 12 Americans held the ridge. Now, maybe 10. He had one last trick left. One last forbidden move. He limped to the center of the ridge, where a supply crate had been buried under palm leaves. He tore it open. Inside were 20 phosphorus grenades. Not for throwing. Too dangerous in close quarters, but for what came next. He yanked 3 pins at once and rolled them into the left valley wall. They detonated with blinding white fire. For 3 seconds, the entire left flank became a sheet of ghostly light. Every Japanese soldier on that side froze, visible in stark silhouette. Every American on the ridge saw them. Left flank. Fire. The ridge erupted again. The enemy left flank collapsed. The survivors retreated into the jungle, blinded and disoriented. 10 minutes later, after a brief silence broken only by rain and groans, the enemy pulled back entirely. Officers blew whistles. Wounded were carried away. Shadows melted into the forest. The Japanese attack died as suddenly as it began. Mack slumped against a tree stump, panting, bleeding, but alive. His men gathered around him, exhausted, trembling, mud-caked. "Sergeant," Collins whispered, we stopped them." Mack looked across the ridge, now a battlefield of churned mud, fallen branches, and bodies. Smoke drifted through the trees. "Yeah," Mack said, "we did." Morgan laughed weakly. Chen wiped his glasses. Even Harrow slumped into a sitting position, head in hands. Collins said, "Sir, that trick of yours, that forbidden thing, what do they call it?" Mack chuckled through the pain. "Improvised, son, just improvised." Word of the ridge defense spread through the division like wildfire. Officers could not believe 12 men had held back 500. When engineers inspected the trench system and the sound pits, they shook their heads in disbelief. It violated nearly every rule. It also saved an entire flank. At dawn, reinforcements arrived, expecting to reclaim a ridge lost during the night. Instead, they found Mack's platoon, bloody, bruised, but standing, holding a position that should have been impossible to hold. And behind them, American artillery remained safe. For months afterward, rumors circulated about McAllister's Ridge and the invisible platoon, tales of a sergeant who made 12 men sound like a battalion. Official reports credited discipline and determination. Unofficial talk credited something else entirely: creativity, defiance, and one forbidden trench trick. Mack never boasted. He never wrote it down. He simply returned to duty, limping slightly, carrying his rifle as if nothing unusual had happened. Years later, long after the war, when younger soldiers asked him how 12 men could stop 500, he always answered the same way. "You don't fight numbers," he'd say. "You fight minds. And the mind panics when it sees and hears what it doesn't understand." He'd pause, smile slightly, and add, "And if the brass says not to do it, it probably works." That night on the ridge, 12 men became a wall of ghosts, loud where they were few, silent where they were many, everywhere and nowhere at once. That night, a forbidden trick saved a battalion. That night, a ridge stood because one sergeant refused to follow a rulebook written for flatter ground, clearer skies, and easier wars. For the men who survived with him, the memory never faded. The rain, the echoing gunfire, the blinding phosphorus light, the mud-choked trenches, and the moment they realized they were still alive. 12 men had done the impossible, and the jungle, for once, whispered in awe.